I was told a story there the other evening about a man who was down in Dingle in the southwestern Kerry, and it was a lovely, gorgeous evening, and the mountains were almost heartbreakingly lovely and blue, and it was a silent, silent evening. The only sound was the sound of a stream tumbling down Sliabh an Uller. And one man, a visitor, was talking to a local man, and he drew attention, like he said, "Isn't the sound of the tumbling water wonderful?" And the old man, the local man, said, "Tá sé ag gléach orin isteach sa tíriachs as a bhfuil sé féin ag teacht." I mean, it is calling us into the eternity out of which it is itself coming, out of which it is itself flowing. And like the eternity that that stream coming down Sliabh an Uller is calling us into isn't an eternity that is behind time. It is an eternity that's right there in front. Do you know what I mean?
Fáilte Romhaibh are welcome back to the profoundly place-based mystical musings of John Moriarty, a wise, incantatory and exasperatingly circuitous Kerryman who taught English literature in Manitoba, then immersed himself in the world's myths and sagas before casting it all to the wind, freeing himself from its constraints to become a groundsman or gardener for hire in the wilds of Connemara. Moriarty often comes across as elusive and mercurial in his writings and talks, and so maybe it's worth focusing for a bit on where he comes from, who his people were. I have a clip of him here describing his mother, and to understand it fully, you need to bear in mind that in Irish mythology, the original land sovereignty figure, the goddess of creation who predates the arrival of humans or farming on the island, was the Cailleach, the wise crone, who dropped rocks from her apron on mountaintops to create sacred sites. She appears to be a metaphor for the retreating of ice sheets, and how they left heaps of stones in certain areas as they melted back to the sea at the end of the last ice age.
And my mother had, I don't know if any of you now would remember, a crossover apron. It was one of these aprons that you just fit yourself into and tie it around your middle, and it was a complete garment covering you. And it was a very useful garment for a farmer's wife, because you could catch the two ends of it, the front two ends of it, and make a great hollow space, and you could fill it with whatever you wanted to fill it with. And here was my mother, a big woman. My mother wasn't physically that big; she was tall, but there was something about her. You had the sense that she was enormous in some sense, because she was so psychologically big and psychologically real that we always had the sense that she was a huge woman, but it was psychologically that she was big. I don't know how any of us ever survived my mother, like to grow up with such enormous reality around you all the time. Like, how do we ever survive the presence of my mother in that house? Like, how did my father survive the presence of that huge, wonderful woman? You know, she was like, people just come in the night, the old night walkers would come, and my mother was better than any Anne Doyle, like, to read the paper, and she'd read the paper for all these men, like, and so she was a great presence in the world. But here she was now coming across the yard, and she was past childbearing at this stage, and so she had the two ends of the crossover apron, holding it in her left hand, and in the Great Depression, it was almost like a womb outside her womb. She was past childbearing, but now she had the womb for crossover apron, and it was filled with turf. And on top of the turf were 6 or 7 eggs. And just as I saw her there coming across from the fowl house, what we used to call the fowl house, the house of the hens and the ducks, as she was coming across there, she looked like a great, wonderful earth mother, and she was so real. I'd been away to universities and libraries and all this kind of stuff, but she remained herself. She was totally unchanged. And her crossover apron with her little pink dots in it, her pink little flowers in it. And here she was, and I was thinking, like, she's last year's turf now she has in this womb, and on top of the turf, on top of the fire, are the eggs. And it was a great Easter image, like the fire of life and the newness of life in the eggs. So she was a kind of great earth mother woman coming across the yard. And so, seeing that, I knew I'm back. Christ heals my mother, I knew I'm back.
Does that help give you some sense of John Moriarty? He's a man who sees his mother as a woman bearing eggs and turf, symbols of fertility and the land, a force of nature who could attract the night walkers to the yard. But not just the night walkers, the horses too.
And a lot of people just come into our house, because of my mother. It was mostly because of my mother that people would come into our house. And there'd be donkeys and carts going up and down the road, and there'd be horses and carts and ponies and carts going up and down to the creameries and going up and down to the village and things like that. And so many of these horses, like, would naturally, without any direction at all from their drivers, like, would come into our yard, because they were so used to coming in and have cups of tea. And I remember summer days, like when these, say, Moss Hatner would come down with his horse and his milk churns, and he would want to go home because he would have hay to cut or turf to cut or something like that, and he would desperately have to wrestle with the horse to keep the horse from going in, and almost always he lost that battle. The horse was so used to coming in, the horse would come into our yard anyway, and they sit down, they discuss the world and the politics and everything, my mother, and, you know, so it was that kind of house.
A woman who'd lure the horses to her yard. It's hard to think of a more mythical description of a parent. That is, of course, until you see how he presents his father. We see him not directly, but through his byre, his barn, his outhouse, which Moriarty regards as the direct opposite of the modern agricultural building of the EEC, the European Economic Community. In fact, it's not even the barn we get to see, but the journey across the yard to it, an odyssey of sorts, though just a few paces in length.
Now, the moment I stood up to go to the stall, I was aware like that I was going to my father's stall. This isn't an EEC stall. This is a stall that existed long before the EEC was heard of, and that was this would now be a sacred journey for me, and I would have felt it in every bone of my body, and in every cell of my being. I would have felt that this is a sacred journey to me now across the yard, because when I was young, a little child, imagining the big world, the world was full of fairies and full of pukas and full of strangers and full of all kinds of presences and radiances that you mightn't know the names of or know how to handle. I would see my father on a dark winter's night. He would take down his lantern. The last thing around 11 o'clock in the night, he would take down his lantern and he would light it. And if it was a wild night, having lit it, he would unscrew, he would wind it back till there was just a little spark of light. And then he would walk out, and I always wondered about, sometimes I'd see just half his face in the light of the kitchen, and the other half would be in the darkness. And I often wondered like about him walking out into that dark, and that he wasn't afraid. And he would cross the wild yard, and he would go over and hang the lantern up on a nail in a rafter, and then he would wind it up, and he'd have good light now again, and he'd feed the cows hay. And having fed the cows hay, I mean, these were short-tawten cows now. These weren't the Frisians that we now have. Like, these were the wonderful short-tawten cows. Remember them? You know, with that lovely fur, their lovely coats, you know, and in the winter, I was always loved to see them licked, you know, the way they'd lick themselves, and there was always waves wherever they'd lick themselves. And sometimes you'd see cow pats or cow dung, cow manure. We never called it cow pats, we called it cow manure, cow dung in the sides of the road or in the fields, like, and they had this wonderful shape. Do you remember? The old shape of cow dung, like, it was like Celtic art, you know, it was all full of torque shapes, wonderful shapes, you know, but now it's all slurry, isn't it, you know, and you know, you don't hear of cow dung anymore, you hear of slurry. But so I was going over to that stall where my father would have laid down a bed of golden straw for the cows, and he would have hay at every cow. Every short-tawten cow would know her place, and she would be tied by her manger. He's 11 cows. And when my father would go over and feed them hay in the night, he would sit in his three-legged stool behind them, and he would smoke his cigarette there. And my father was from Dingle, so he grew up speaking Irish, and he'd be a smíanamh, is a machn of them féin over there, because he loved the sound of the cows chewing and the sound of the cows chewing the cud. And sometimes, like, after I went to university, my father would know, like, that I was studying things like philosophy, and I was, you know, the big questions, the big answers. My father would come in, like, and he'd say, "Christ, John, I've come to the end of thinking and I still haven't found answers," you know. But of course, like, the poor man, he'd be a smíanamh, a machn of them féin over there in the stall, you know. So I knew, like, that was over there, every cow having a name, that was over to that stall I was going.
That's Moriarty to a T. A man for whom the journey to the cowshed becomes a philosophical exploration of existence. A place of golden torques on golden straw in the form of muck, cowpiss and dung. It was this ancient, nature-based, almost indigenous upbringing, combined with a fervid, questioning mind. A bhí agónaí ag smíanamh is a machnamh, that was forever pondering and cogitating, that left him so disorientated with and by modern existence. He frequently talks about dropping out, escaping, going walkabout, a past master at quietly quitting before the term had even been coined. He imagined following his soul's calling and just walking away from the humdrum, and what the repercussions of that might be.
I remember the times when I was thinking of quitting in Manitoba, and wondering, is that true? If I walk out of my job, if I walk out of this thing called a career, would I be looked after? If I walked out for the right reasons, would I be looked after? There is a story that people who did walk out, the ravens fed them. They went off into the desert and the ravens fed them. Would I be looked after? I mean, when I look at the laws of gravity as Newton has elaborated them and spelled them out, I want to say, are these true of the universe? And I can go to a scientist and he can demonstrate to me how they are true of the universe. Now, is it also true of the universe? Is the universe the kind of place? Is it such a place that if I do walk out and seek the kingdom of God, then all things else shall be added unto me? And I was often fascinated by that. Is this true of the universe? Would I be an Elijah fed by the ravens if I did walk out? Will I be looked after? Will Providence look after me if I walk out? So I imagine myself now this day horse trading with God, standing outside on the road, and I hear this, sell all you have, give it to the poor. So I empty my pockets, all the pockets of my trousers and all the pockets of my jacket, and I just let everything that's in them fall to the ground. And it isn't only the pockets of my jacket and my coat that I empty the pockets of my mind as well. So all my theories and creeds, all my knowing, I empty the lobes of my mind, turn those pockets inside out. So I walk up the road. I have walked out now. I walk up the road. I am poor in spirit now. I'm poor externally and poor inwardly now, poor doctrinally and poor materially. And I walk up the road, having let all that I am or have fall to the ground. And 5 miles up the road, there's a thin wind blowing, and I think, Christ, have I really walked out? And I'm wondering, must I now never again worry where the night falls on me or where the day breaks on me? Where the night falls on me now or where the day breaks on me must not be a concern of mine. I must no longer ever concern myself with this now. But there's a thin wind blowing as I continue to walk out. So I'm wondering, can I call my own bluff now? Have I actually walked out? But this thin, cold wind is blowing, and there's a reek of turf, and I decide I'll sit down by the reek of turf for a while.
That's my man. Born in 1938, and yet asking the questions that we still want answers to today, and actually putting his ideas into practice, tuning in and dropping out. Just like Timothy Leary and Ken Kesey, and Gaelic Allen Ginsberg, encouraging us to take a break from it all for a while, from the madness and deception, and join him there, sitting by the pile of turf, taking stock, allowing time and space for new insights, new downloads. I'm going to leave you with one final musing of his, where he uses mirrors as metaphors for the delusion we surround ourselves with. But before I go, if you want more Moriarty, there's plenty of his talks on YouTube, and the RT Radio website has some footage. But the best way of truly engaging with Moriarty is through his books. Either the 3 works of edited extracts published by Lilliput Press, the most recent being the brilliant The Hut at the Edge of the Village by Martin Shaw, or his own full-length books, some of which can be quite meandering and bewildering unless you dive in deep. These 2 were published by Lilliput, which has been a champion of John Moriarty for decades now. It's Lilliput who put together the recorded talks titled One Evening in Eden that I've been able to extract from here. There's also a great memoir by Mary McGillicuddy. Anyway, here's one final clip of him talking about escaping the mirrors and how we can lose ourselves and free ourselves in the world of the night.
So we live in this world of mirrors, and it's wonderful sometimes in Connemara to walk out into that dark, into a world from which all mirrors have disappeared. The mirrors of people and ordinary mirrors and the mirrors of lakes, all these mirrors have disappeared. And walking down that road, the night behind the night, it isn't a night of stars, and you sense like that this isn't a night that began with nightfall, and it isn't a night that's going to end with dawn. It is a deeper kind of darkness altogether. This is a richer, deeper, stranger kind of darkness. This isn't a darkness that has the ordinary kind of night lights in it. So walking down that road, I mean, I would imagine that if I met Dan Quinn coming up the road and Dan asked me what time it was, like I would have to say to Dan, the Lord save us, Dan, I don't know what time it was. Like, I don't know what time it is at all. Are we in time anymore? Like, have we left time? I mean, certainly if we are in time, it is a time that is older than the time of chronometers. So, you know, and if he asked me who was I, I'd say, Dan, I don't know who am I, because I only know who I am when in a world of mirrors, you know. When mirrors are gone, I don't know who I am at all. But anyway, so it's the wonder and the strangeness of going out into a night, behind the night, into the night when all mirroring is gone from the world.